good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today, I will be discussing the new song I recently released called Song of Samples. In this video, I'm going to break up the song into 4 sections: intro, section A, section B, and section C, and I will explain what sounds and effects I used for each. As you can see, the intro consists of 16 sounds that I recorded around my house with my iPhone. These same 16 sounds are used for everything you hear later on in the song. I knew I wanted to have an introduction that showcased all the samples, but I didn't exactly know what to do. So I lined up all the sounds and pressed play. Immediately, I knew that had to be the intro. It is a very bizarre introduction, to say the least, but at the same time it has a sort of musicality and rhythm to it. So let's break it down. The next step was to record all the samples into a single stem. After that, I added 2 effects. One of them was the Abbey Road Chambers. And the next one was just a small shift delay mod that is a default effect from Ableton. When putting it all together, it sounds like this. I use those 2 effects because it just feels like the song is slipping away from you and creates this really ambient sound to it. And it also makes for a great transition into section A. Usually when I start a project, I have the core instruments ready and kind of have a roadmap of where I'm going to take this song. In this case, I had to create the instruments first. I started off by creating the drum rack with my selection of sounds to see what I can make out of them. So these are the sounds that I have. This is me brushing a piece of metal with some effects on it. They're both the same, they're just different notes. And then I have a hammer on a brick, a hammer on a wheel, a key ignition from an old Toyota 4Runner, a box of seeds that sounds like Minecraft, AirPods, and an emergency brake. Now the kick drum is in a separate stem, and it's me hitting a wooden bed, and it sounds like this. Altogether, the drums sound like this. So one of the difficult things with working with just Foley is that there is no pitch to it, there's no tone, unless you make it or you somehow manipulate the sound to sound like that. And what I do for most of these tracks is that I use something called Resonators. So, as you can see here, this one's called Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Resonator. The note is a C, and without this resonator, it just sounds like a brush on metal. Really annoying and prickly. When I add the resonators and add all those pitches and textures to it, it sounds like this. That gives me more room to play around with the notes and to see if they fit in the chords that I choose. The hi-hat is a key ignition. Now usually the full key ignition would sound like this, but I just wanted that little tick at the beginning, so it has that little really percussive accent to it. All I added was a hi-hat EQ with some reverb. Now the box of seeds, the one that sounds like something from Minecraft, is exactly what it is. It's just a box of seeds, but without this filter. Without the filter, it sounds like this. But with the filter, it adds a little bit more texture and adds a little bit more overtones. Sort of an echo to it. The AirPods, which are the snares, are really simple as well. They have the same thing as before, just reverb and some mixing tools to it. And the other 2 effects that it has is a snare EQ and a squeeze box. With the squeeze box, it gives it more of a grainy and kind of an 8-bit feel to it. It expounds the sound and makes it sound more full, like an actual snare. So with it on, it sounds like this. Now, my favorite part is the kick drum. The kick drum took a while to get because it's just me hitting a wooden bed. And just like the other sounds, all I have is an EQ on this one. The EQ just boosts the highs and the lows just to get that punchiness. And with that, it sounds like this. It sounds really close to an actual bass drum. Now, moving on to the next part of section A is the melody. Now, the melody is just the key ignition with a couple of effects on it. For this one, it's just reverb, a little bit of adjusting in the frequency range, attack, the decay is a little bit higher, so is the release, and it's also transposed a couple pitches down and tuned to the note of C. Now, with just those simple edits, the melody sounds like this. Notice that it sounds a little bit different from the song. Well, that's because I don't have the other plugins activated. Now, the other plugins that I used is this effect that I downloaded from this Instagram. His name is blank4.ms and always uploads these amazing ambient tape songs. Now, he released this plugin that emulates a tape recorder, as if the instrument is playing off of tape and adding these all other cool effects to it. With the tape effect on, it sounds like this. You know, it gives it a little bit more texture and opens up the sound. Another thing that I use to open up the track is called the Real ATD Stereo from the Abbey Road collection. Now this really just opens up the sample and kind of creates a little phase between the two speakers. So without it, it sounds like this. And with it, it sounds like this. It adds a little bit more texture and phase to it, creating this really cool synth sound to it. The next part of this melody is just a little fill that I created to introduce section B. Now, the other fundamental instrument in this song is the bass. It sounds like I'm almost using a real bass, but in fact, it's just, again, the key ignition, pitched really low with different attack, different decay, and release, while also adding a whole lot of effects so it can have that bass feel to it. Now, as you can see, it's a lot of them. With them off, the bass sounds like this. It sounds really basic and dull. But once you start adding the effects to it, it starts to open up more. So the effects that I use is a lot more compared to the other instruments. I added reverb, a bass pedal, a bass EQ, bass speaker, a bass amplifier, and a compressor. Now, as you heard, this adds a lot more dynamic to the sound and creates that realistic bass sound. The next most important part of the song is these chords that I created. So as you can see, I used C, G, E, and A. And they consist of me scraping a hammer on bare wood. Now, the original sound sounds like this. And as I said before, to add pitch and tone to a sound that doesn't have any, I use the Resonator. In this one, I used an EQ, a saturator, and of course, that tape effect. When all that put together, it sounds like this. As you notice, I can only record one note at a time using the Resonator, so I had to record at different notes by changing up from C, E, A, and G. And once I've done that, I get these really cool background chords that support the song. As you can hear, there's a lot more to it as well. I have this effect called Nostalgia, which is another Ableton plugin. I have the ambience reverb, and I have a sidechain compressor that is picking up audio from the kick drum. And lastly, I have a top spreader. Without any of these effects on, it sounds like this. But once I start adding the effects slowly, it starts to have more character to it. Now, the last thing I want to touch upon in section A are these sound effect fills that I like to call them. And they're just random sound effects that I have in my sound library that I like to use to introduce instruments or certain sections of the song. One of my favorite ones is this one that a lot of people mention that it sounds like if marble is being rolled around on the floor, but in reality it's just a creaking door that I've shown you before with just different effects on it. Without any of the effects, it sounds like this. It's a creaking door, right? But now when I start adding the grains, the reverb, and this really weird effect on Ableton called Corpus, it sounds like this. And I'm sure you will hear that throughout the video because I like using that to transition from different sections. The next effect that I like to use is the coffee maker. And yeah, it's just a coffee maker with some effects on it. So it sounds like this. And as you can hear, there's a little bit of echo to it, and that's because I added this echo that has the sounds transiting from the left to the right for not too long. It has a little bit of reverb on it, as you can see, and that's about it. But without it, it's just the coffee maker itself. But with all of it, it sounds really cool and adds a little bit more ambient texture to the song. Now, the next effect that I want to talk about is the creaking door, but it's not the one like last time. This one's a little bit different. I tried to create many instruments from the same sounds that I have, since I'm very limited. And this is another fill that I created. The process for this one was the same. I had the resonators and just reverb, and that's about it. Altogether, section A sounds like this. So welcome to section B. In this section, I had to create two new instruments. The first instrument is this new synth. And the second instrument is this ambient synth. And yes, these two instruments were still made with the sounds that I recorded around my house. Let's take a look at the first synth. The first synth is still made up of that same key ignition that I used before in my other instruments. Without any of the effects, the chord would sound like this. Sounds really basic and boring and just like a regular bell synth. However, with this guitar reverb chopper and the delay that I put on it, it sounds really ambient and spacious. Now this is the same instrument that I used for the melody and the bass. I think the only thing that I changed was probably the attack and the release, but other than that, it's still the same. The effects that I use is this guitar chopper, and as you can see, there's these two little red dots. Now the two little red dots are what I use to automate the tremolo speed and the tremolo amount. That's what creates the really arpeggiated sound as if it's decaying around you. These are the automations that I drew for the synth. If I change it up, it changes up the tremolo speed and sound. The next synth that I created is that ambient sound that you hear in the background. It almost sounds cinematic-like. As you can see, the name is also Creaking Door. Now you'd be surprised that I still use that same creaking door effect that I've used for the other ones. Let me show you what I did to it. So the same sample that I used in the drum kit and the ones that I used for the sound effect fills was used to create this synth. Now as you can see, I almost have the exact same effects that I used for the melody and for the last synth that I showed you. I have the resonators, a phaser, a saturator, a filter delay, a compressor, and reverb. Without any of those effects on, the sample would sound like this. Sounds really harsh and weird, but that's because out of this entire recording that you see here, I only used a millisecond of the recording. If I would have used the entire portion of that sound, it would sound like this. But as you can hear, it's really slow and I need to speed it up more. So what I do is that I just compress the sample that I need. so it loops a specific area that I want. And when I start to slowly add the effects to it, this is how it starts to sound. As you can see, the first one that makes a big difference is the resonator, and then the phaser, and then the saturator, the filter delay, the compressor, and reverb. And that's what gives it that really ambient and spacious sound to it. And that's all I did to create that background synth. And as you can see, the resonator is tuned to the note of C just to make it easier for me to create the chords that I want. Now the chords that I used for the main synth melody are A minor, G sharp augmented, and C. Now when the song is resolved here, there is a lot of instruments playing at the same time. First, the root note of the bass, the C chord, the background synth, and this third synth that I created by adding this ambient sample into a sampler and then creating an instrument out of it. So that way I'm not limited to just the note of C from the resonator, and I can just play it on my MIDI keyboard. As you can hear, it has a higher pitch to it, and then I later on use it to introduce section C. And the drums are slowly introduced once again. With all of it together, section B sounds like this. Now moving on to section C. The only difference in this part of the song is the new melody that I created with that same key ignition ring. And it sounds like this. The effects for this melody is the same guitar reverb chopper that I used on the last section to create that really spacious and traveling chord with a piano EQ and the Abbey Road Real ADT. The bass is the same, the only difference is the groove that it's playing. It's a little bit more funkier and upbeat. And other than that are the chords that I added in the background as well. Not only do you hear the same ambient background as before, slowly fading away, with the same creaking door, but also with the same ambient and spacious chords that I use in section B, I'm also using them in section C. And as you can hear, it's side changed to the kick drum. Altogether, section C sounds like this. Thank you so much for watching this behind the scenes of how I created Song of Samples. If you're interested in listening to the song, you can either check it out on my channel or you can go on SoundCloud. The link will be in the description down below. Thank you for your time.